Racist cop boots black man from court, shocked to learn he's FBI chief. What if the quiet dignity you've carried your whole life suddenly meant nothing to someone who'd never bothered to see past your skin? The marble courthouse steps gleamed wet from morning rain, and Detective Marcus Williams straightened his navy suit jacket one last time before walking through those heavy oak doors. At 53, he'd learned that respect wasn't automatically given. It was earned through decades of service, integrity, and the kind of quiet strength his grandmother had taught him at her kitchen table all those years ago. But some mornings, walking into spaces where you don't quite fit, you remember that not everyone got the memo about who you really are. The echo of his dress shoes on polished floors mixed with hushed conversations and rustling papers, a symphony he'd heard in courthouses across 3 states during his 28 years in law enforcement. Today felt different, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. "Where are you watching from today? I'd love to know." Marcus had driven 2 hours from Baltimore that Tuesday morning, his FBI credentials tucked safely in the breast pocket of his suit jacket alongside a letter from the Justice Department. The Fairfield County Courthouse wasn't familiar territory. He usually worked federal cases in major metropolitan areas, but this civil rights investigation required his presence at a local hearing that could set important precedents. His wife Sarah had packed him coffee in his favorite thermos, the one their daughter Emma had given him for Father's Day, and kissed his cheek before he left their suburban home. "Be safe out there," she'd whispered, the same words she'd said every morning for the past 15 years of their marriage. The case involved allegations of discriminatory policing practices in Fairfield County, and Marcus was there to observe proceedings and gather information for a broader federal investigation. As the newly appointed assistant director of the FBI's Civil Rights Division, these kinds of sensitive assignments had become his specialty. He'd built his career on being the calm presence in heated situations, the man who could bridge divides and find common ground even when tensions ran high. Inside the courthouse, Marcus found his way to Courtroom B, where the hearing was scheduled to begin at 9 o'clock. The room was already filling with attorneys, local officials, and community members who'd taken time off work to witness what many considered a watershed moment for their small city. Marcus chose a seat in the back, preferring to observe quietly rather than draw attention to his federal oversight role. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across worn wooden pews that had seen decades of justice served and denied. Marcus pulled out a small notebook, one of those composition books he'd used since his rookie days, and began jotting down initial observations about the courtroom's atmosphere and the people gathering for what promised to be a contentious hearing. Officer Dale Brennan had been working courthouse security for 6 months, a temporary assignment while he recovered from a shoulder injury sustained during what he called a routine traffic stop gone wrong. At 34, Dale carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd never questioned his authority or wondered whether others might see the world differently than he did. His uniform was pressed sharp, his badge polished bright, and his patience for what he considered disruptions was notably thin. Dale noticed Marcus immediately, not because he recognized him as a federal official, but because he made assumptions that 20 years of cultural progress hadn't quite reached into every corner of law enforcement. In Dale's mind, courtrooms were serious places for serious people, and he developed his own personal criteria for determining who belonged and who might be there to cause trouble. "Excuse me," Dale said, approaching Marcus with the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "Can I see some identification? We're having a sensitive hearing this morning, and we need to make sure everyone here has legitimate business." Marcus looked up from his notebook, momentarily surprised but not entirely unused to such requests. He'd learned long ago that cooperation often opened doors more quickly than confrontation. "Of course, officer," he replied calmly, reaching into his jacket pocket. But instead of pulling out his FBI credentials, he mistakenly grabbed his driver's license, a simple mix-up that would cascade into something much larger. Dale glanced at the license, saw an out-of-state address, and made another assumption. "Baltimore, huh? We don't usually get observers from out of town unless they're here to stir up trouble. I think you'd be more comfortable watching from outside." The room had begun to quiet as other attendees noticed the interaction. Marcus felt the familiar weight of being judged by his appearance rather than his character, a burden he'd carried since childhood but had hoped might lighten as he climbed the ranks of federal law enforcement. Still, he kept his voice level and respectful. "Officer, I'm here on official business. If you'll let me show you my proper credentials. I've seen enough, Dale interrupted, his voice rising just enough to catch the attention of people in nearby seats. Sir, I need you to step outside. We can't have disruptions during these proceedings. Marcus felt his grandmother's voice in his ear, reminding him that dignity meant keeping your composure even when others lost theirs. He stood slowly, closing his notebook and tucking it back into his jacket pocket. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, investigating discriminatory practices, while experiencing them firsthand. But he also knew that making a scene wouldn't serve the greater purpose of his mission. As Marcus walked toward the courtroom doors, he could hear whispers rippling through the crowd. Some people looked uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, while others seemed to accept it as normal courthouse procedure. The weight of generations of similar moments pressed on his shoulders, all those times when good people had been told they didn't belong in places where justice was supposed to be blind. Standing in the corridor outside Courtroom B, Marcus finally pulled out his FBI credentials and badge, studying them in the fluorescent light. 28 years of service, commendations from 3 different directors, and a security clearance that had taken him from drug cartels to terrorism cases. Yet none of that had mattered in the 30 seconds it took for Officer Brennan to decide he didn't belong. The courthouse corridor was quieter now, with most people inside waiting for the hearing to begin. Marcus could hear the muffled sounds of the proceedings starting without him, the very proceedings he'd been sent to monitor. He pulled out his cell phone and scrolled to his supervisor's number, then paused. How exactly do you explain that you've been removed from a civil rights hearing because of civil rights violations? 20 minutes passed before Marcus decided to approach the courtroom doors again. Through the glass, he could see Officer Brennan stationed near the back, arms crossed, looking quite satisfied with his morning's work. The hearing had begun, and Marcus could catch glimpses of attorneys presenting arguments that he was supposed to be documenting for his federal report. As he reached for the door handle, Dale was there immediately. I thought I made myself clear, the officer said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. You need to leave the building entirely. We can't have people lingering around who don't have proper business here. This time, Marcus decided to take a different approach. He pulled out his FBI credentials and held them at eye level, speaking with the measured tone he'd perfected during decades of de-escalating tense situations. Officer, I'm Assistant Director Marcus Williams with the FBI's Civil Rights Division. I'm here conducting official federal business related to this hearing. Dale barely glanced at the credentials. In his experience, people trying to cause problems often came armed with fake badges and elaborate stories. Sir, I don't know where you got those, but I need you to leave immediately, or I'll have to place you under arrest for trespassing. The threat hung in the air between them like smoke. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, not anger exactly, but a profound sadness for how far they all still had to go. Here he was, a man who'd dedicated his life to serving justice, being threatened with arrest for trying to do his job. The credentials in his hand represented nearly 3 decades of climbing through law enforcement ranks, of proving himself over and over again, of being twice as good to get half the recognition. I understand you have a job to do, Marcus said quietly, but so do I. These credentials are real, and I'm here at the direction of the Department of Justice. Perhaps you could verify with your supervisor. Dale's radio crackled to life with routine courthouse communications, but he ignored it. Something about Marcus's calm demeanor was actually making him more irritated, not less. In Dale's worldview, people who were lying usually got nervous when confronted with authority, and Marcus's composed responses didn't fit the narrative he'd already constructed. I don't need to verify anything, Dale replied, his hand moving to rest on his radio. I'm ordering you to leave this building, and if you refuse, I'll arrest you for interfering with official proceedings. Inside the courtroom, the hearing continued, but several people near the windows had begun to notice the commotion in the corridor. Among them was Judge Patricia Hendricks, a 20-year veteran of the bench who'd built her reputation on fairness and attention to detail. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see through the glass that something significant was happening. Marcus made a decision that would have surprised many people who knew him professionally. Instead of escalating the situation, or demanding to speak with Dale's supervisor. He simply nodded and began walking toward the courthouse exit. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful response to unreasonable behavior was to let it reveal itself fully. As he walked down the marble corridor, his dress shoes echoing off the walls, Marcus thought about his daughter Emma, now a sophomore at Howard University studying criminal justice. She'd grown up believing that her father's work was making the world more fair, more just. How would he explain this to her? How would he tell her that even at his level, even with his credentials and his record, some things remained unchanged? Outside the courthouse, Marcus sat on a bench that offered a clear view of the building's impressive facade. The morning sun was warmer now, and he loosened his tie slightly while pulling out his phone. His first call was to his supervisor, Deputy Director Janet Morrison, a woman who'd mentored him through his rise in the bureau and who never minced words when situations required clarity. "Janet, it's Marcus. I need to brief you on a situation that's developed at the Fairfield hearing." He explained the morning's events in the same methodical way he'd report any other incident, keeping his voice professional even as he described being escorted out of the very proceedings he'd been sent to monitor. "Marcus, are you telling me that a local officer refused to recognize your federal credentials and removed you from a civil rights hearing?" Janet's voice carried the kind of controlled incredulity that suggested swift action would follow. "That's correct. I have his name and badge number, and I believe this incident may be relevant to the broader investigation we're conducting." "Stay exactly where you are," Janet said. "I'm making some calls." While he waited, Marcus pulled out the thermos Sarah had packed and poured himself coffee that was still warm. The bitter sweetness reminded him of breakfast that morning, of his wife's kiss on his cheek, of the normalcy he'd left behind to drive 2 hours for a job that apparently didn't want him there. A text message chimed on his phone. It was from Emma. "Dad, saw on the news that your case is being heard today. So proud of the work you're doing. Love you." Marcus stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Love you too, sweetheart. Learning something new every day." 30 minutes later, a black SUV with government plates pulled up to the courthouse. Marcus watched as Deputy Director Morrison stepped out, followed by 2 other agents he recognized from headquarters. She spotted him on the bench and walked over with a kind of purposeful stride that suggested the morning was about to take a very different turn. "Well," she said, settling beside him on the bench, "this is about to get interesting. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up." Sometimes the most important changes begin with the smallest acts of courage. Deputy Director Morrison didn't waste time with small talk. She'd known Marcus for 8 years, had watched him handle everything from domestic terrorism cases to complex civil rights investigations, and she'd never seen him rattled. That he was sitting calmly on a courthouse bench after being ejected from an official hearing spoke volumes about both his professionalism and the gravity of what had just occurred. "Walk me through it again," she said, pulling out her own notebook. "Every detail, every word exchanged. This isn't just about you anymore, Marcus. This is about federal authority being dismissed at a local level, and that has implications beyond this single case." As Marcus recounted the morning's events, he found himself remembering small details he'd initially overlooked. The way Officer Brennan had looked past him rather than at him, the assumption in the man's voice that suggested this kind of interaction was routine for him, the complete dismissal of credentials that should have immediately established Marcus's legitimate presence. "What strikes me most," Marcus told Janet, "is that he never actually looked at my FBI identification. He made a decision about who I was before I ever had a chance to show him who I actually am." Inside the courthouse, the hearing had taken a recess, and Judge Hendricks was in her chambers asking pointed questions of her bailiff about the incident she'd witnessed in the corridor. She'd seen enough courtroom drama to recognize when something was seriously amiss, and the image of a well-dressed professional being escorted out by security had been troubling her throughout the morning's proceedings. "Get me Officer Brennan," she told her bailiff, "and find out who that gentleman was that he removed from the building. Something about this doesn't feel right." Meanwhile, Dale Brennan was in the courthouse security office, filling out an incident report that painted his morning's actions in the most favorable possible light. In his version, He'd prevented a potential disruption by removing someone who appeared to be there under false pretenses and refused to cooperate with security procedures. He'd filed similar reports before, and they'd never been questioned. What Dale didn't know was that the courthouse's security cameras had recorded the entire interaction, and that footage was about to become very important evidence in a much larger conversation about law enforcement practices and federal oversight. Deputy Director Morrison stood up from the bench, her decision made. "Marcus, I want you to know that what happened here today isn't just going to be swept under the rug. But I also want you to think about something. This incident, as frustrating and humiliating as it was, has given us a perfect example of exactly the kind of systemic issues we're here to investigate." Marcus nodded slowly. He'd already come to the same conclusion, but hearing it from Janet helped clarify his path forward. "You want me to use this as a case study? I want you to turn your professional experience today into professional evidence. Every assumption that officer made, every procedure he ignored, every courtesy he denied, it's all part of the pattern we're here to document and address." Back inside the courthouse, Judge Hendricks was learning some very uncomfortable truths. Her bailiff had returned with Officer Brennan's incident report and some additional information that made her reach for her phone immediately. "Officer Brennan," she said when he appeared in her chambers, "I need you to explain to me why you removed FBI Assistant Director Marcus Williams from this morning's hearing." The color drained from Dale's face as the judge's words sank in. "Ma'am, the man didn't properly identify himself. He showed me a driver's license from Baltimore and seemed evasive about his reasons for being here." Judge Hendricks pulled up the security footage on her computer, turning the screen so Dale could see his own interaction with Marcus. "This is you asking for identification. This is the gentleman reaching into his jacket. And this is you interrupting him and making the decision to remove him before he could show you what he was reaching for. Is that accurate?" Dale watched himself on the screen, seeing his actions from an outside perspective for the first time. The confident authority he'd felt that morning now looked like something else entirely: hasty, prejudiced, and professionally embarrassing. "Your Honor, I was trying to maintain courtroom security. I made a judgment call based on..." "Based on what, Officer Brennan? Help me understand your reasoning process, because I'm looking at a federal law enforcement official being ejected from proceedings he was assigned to monitor, and I can't see any security threat in this footage." Outside, Marcus was walking back toward the courthouse with Deputy Director Morrison and the 2 additional agents. They'd spent the past hour developing a strategy that would address both the immediate situation and the broader implications for their investigation. "Remember," Janet told him as they climbed the marble steps, "you're not here seeking revenge or trying to humiliate anyone. You're here to ensure that federal authority is respected and that the civil rights investigation can proceed as mandated by the Department of Justice." Marcus straightened his tie and checked his badge one more time. 28 years of experience had taught him that real change happened when people chose to do better, not when they were simply forced to comply. Today would be a test of whether Officer Brennan and the courthouse system were capable of that kind of growth. As they reached the courthouse doors, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the glass, a 53-year-old man who'd spent his career building bridges and seeking justice, now about to walk back into a building that had rejected him hours earlier. But this time, he wasn't walking in alone, and he wasn't walking in as someone whose identity could be dismissed. The morning sun was now high overhead, warming the marble steps where he'd sat questioning his daughter's faith in the system he'd devoted his life to serving. In a few minutes, he'd be back in that courtroom, not as an unwelcome observer, but as the federal official he'd always been. Have you ever faced something like this? Share your experience in the comments. Sometimes our greatest challenges become our most powerful testimonies. The courthouse lobby fell silent as Marcus Williams walked through the front doors flanked by 3 other federal agents. The morning shift of security personnel, court clerks, and early arriving attorneys all seemed to sense that something significant was happening, though most didn't yet understand exactly what. Judge Hendricks met them personally at the elevator, an unusual courtesy that spoke volumes about how seriously she was taking the morning's events. At 62, she'd seen enough to recognize a watershed moment when it presented itself. and she was determined that her courthouse would handle this situation with the dignity and professionalism it should have shown from the beginning. "Assistant Director Williams," she said, extending her hand, "I want to personally apologize for how you were treated in my courthouse this morning. It was completely unacceptable, and we're going to address it comprehensively." Marcus shook her hand, appreciating both her directness and her willingness to take personal responsibility for what had happened under her watch. "Your Honor, I'm grateful for your response. What's most important now is ensuring that the federal investigation can proceed as intended and that we can learn from this incident moving forward." In the security office, Officer Dale Brennan was discovering what genuine accountability looked like. His supervisor, Captain Rodriguez, had arrived from the main precinct after receiving a call that no law enforcement administrator ever wants to get. Notification that one of his officers had ejected a federal agent from a courthouse without cause. "Dale, I need you to explain to me how this happened," Captain Rodriguez said, his voice carrying 25 years of experience managing officers who sometimes made catastrophically poor decisions. "Because what I'm seeing in this report and what I'm hearing from the federal agents doesn't match up." Dale sat in a plastic chair that suddenly felt very uncomfortable, watching security footage that made his morning's actions look increasingly indefensible. The confident authority he'd felt while ejecting Marcus had evaporated, replaced by the growing realization that he'd made assumptions that were about to cost him dearly. "Sir, I thought the man seemed suspicious, and I was trying to protect the integrity of the proceedings. I didn't know he was FBI." Captain Rodriguez paused the footage at the moment when Marcus had reached into his jacket, clearly attempting to show additional identification before Dale had cut him off. "He tried to show you proper credentials, and you refused to look at them. Help me understand the thought process behind that decision." Back in Courtroom B, the hearing had resumed with a very different atmosphere. Marcus now sat in the front row, his notebook open, his federal authority unquestioned. The attorneys presenting arguments seemed more measured in their language, and the local officials more attentive to the broader implications of their words and actions. Deputy Director Morrison had positioned herself where she could observe both the proceedings and the courtroom security, sending a clear message that federal oversight was now a visible presence. The morning's incident had transformed from an embarrassing disruption into a powerful demonstration of why such oversight was necessary. During the lunch recess, Marcus found himself in Judge Hendrick's chambers for a conversation that would prove pivotal not just for this case, but for how the courthouse would handle diversity and federal cooperation going forward. "I want you to know," the judge told him, "that we're implementing immediate changes to our security protocols. Every officer assigned to courthouse duty will receive training on recognizing federal credentials, and we're establishing clear procedures for when questions arise about someone's authority to be present." Marcus appreciated the concrete steps, but he was more interested in the broader implications. "Your Honor, what happened to me this morning probably happens to other people regularly. People who don't have FBI credentials to eventually prove their legitimacy. The real question is how we create systems that treat everyone with basic dignity and respect." Judge Hendricks nodded slowly. She'd been thinking the same thing during the morning's proceedings, watching the faces in her courtroom and wondering how many other people had been judged by their appearance rather than their purpose. "What would you recommend?" "Start with training that goes beyond just recognizing badges. Help your staff understand that assumptions based on appearance have no place in a courthouse. Teach them to ask respectful questions and to listen to the answers. And create accountability systems so that when someone does overstep, there are meaningful consequences." Meanwhile, Officer Brennan was learning about those consequences firsthand. Captain Rodriguez had made his decision after reviewing the footage, consulting with the courthouse administration, and considering the broader impact on community relations. "Dale, you're being suspended pending a full internal affairs investigation. You'll also be required to complete bias training and community sensitivity courses before any consideration of reinstatement. This kind of judgment error reflects poorly on our entire department." The suspension wasn't just about punishment, it was about sending a clear message that law enforcement officers were expected to treat all citizens with equal respect and professionalism, regardless of their personal assumptions or biases. As the afternoon hearing resumed, Marcus observed something he'd seen many times in his federal career: the power of accountability to change behavior. The same attorneys who'd seemed cavalier about civil rights issues that morning were now choosing their words more carefully. The same officials who'd appeared dismissive of federal oversight were now asking thoughtful questions about compliance and best practices. Change, Marcus reflected as he took notes, often happened not through grand gestures but through moments when people realized their actions had consequences and chose to do better. Officer Brennan's suspension would send ripples through the local law enforcement community, reminding every officer that their badges came with responsibilities as well as authority. During a brief recess, Marcus received a text from his wife Sarah, saw the news about what happened. "Are you okay?" Emma called, "She's proud of how you're handling it." He typed back, "All good. Justice is slow, but it's still justice." The afternoon sun streamed through the courtroom windows, casting the same long shadows Marcus had noticed that morning, but everything felt different now. He was no longer an unwelcome observer but a respected federal official whose presence commanded the attention it deserved. More importantly, his morning's experience had become part of the very investigation he'd been sent to conduct. If you've been moved by this journey of dignity and justice, subscribe for more heartfelt stories that remind us why character matters. 3 months later, Marcus Williams stood once again on the marble steps of the Fairfield County Courthouse, but this time he wasn't alone. Beside him stood Captain Rodriguez, Judge Hendricks, and surprisingly, Officer Dale Brennan, who had requested to be part of the ceremony they were about to witness. The morning was crisp and clear, much like that day in September when everything had started, but the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Today, the courthouse was celebrating the completion of a comprehensive review of its security and civil rights procedures, reforms that had grown directly out of Marcus's experience and the federal investigation it had informed. Dale Brennan had changed considerably over those 3 months. The bias training and community service he'd been required to complete had opened his eyes to perspectives he'd never considered before. Working alongside community activists and civil rights leaders, he'd come to understand how his assumptions that September morning had reflected years of unconscious prejudice that he'd never examined. "I want to apologize again," Dale said to Marcus as they climbed the courthouse steps together. "Not just for what I did, but for why I did it. I made assumptions about you that had nothing to do with who you are or why you were there, and I'm grateful you gave me the opportunity to learn from that mistake." Marcus studied the younger man's face, seeing genuine remorse and growth rather than the defensive authority that had characterized their first encounter. "Dale, what matters most is what we do moving forward. The fact that you're here today, helping to implement these changes, tells me you understand that." Inside the courthouse, the main lobby had been transformed into a community meeting space where local residents, law enforcement officers, court personnel, and federal officials had gathered to witness the unveiling of new protocols that would ensure every person entering the building was treated with dignity and respect. Judge Hendricks took the podium first, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd learned important lessons about leadership and accountability. 3 months ago, this courthouse failed to live up to its most basic obligations, to treat every person fairly regardless of their appearance or background. Today, we're implementing changes that will ensure that failure never happens again. The new protocols were comprehensive: mandatory bias training for all courthouse personnel, clear procedures for credential verification, community oversight panels to review security incidents, and regular audits by federal civil rights officials. But more than the formal changes, there was a shift in culture that everyone could feel. Marcus spoke next, his words measured and hopeful. "What happened to me that September morning could have ended in bitterness and division. Instead, it became an opportunity for growth, understanding, and positive change. That's the power of choosing justice over vengeance, reform over revenge." As he spoke, Marcus thought about his daughter Emma, now in her junior year and interning with a civil rights organization in Washington. She'd written her midterm paper on her father's experience, titling it, "When Justice Comes Home." The pride in her voice when she'd read it to him over the phone had meant more than any professional recognition he'd ever received. After the ceremony, Marcus found himself alone for a moment in the courthouse corridor where he'd been escorted out 3 months earlier. The space looked the same: polished marble floors, tall windows, the echo of footsteps and hushed conversations, but it felt entirely different. Today, he belonged here not because of his federal credentials, but because the courthouse itself had chosen to become a place where everyone belonged. Sarah had driven down from Baltimore for the ceremony, and she found him there in the corridor, lost in thought. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, slipping her hand into his. "Just thinking about how far we've all come," Marcus replied. "That morning, I sat outside feeling like the system had failed. Today, I watched the system choose to do better. That's not something you see every day." They walked outside together, where the late afternoon sun was casting the same long shadows Marcus remembered from his first visit. But now those shadows felt different, not ominous, but peaceful, like the end of a long day well spent. Captain Rodriguez joined them on the courthouse steps, looking out at the small crowd of community members and media representatives who'd covered the day's events. "You know," he said to Marcus, "Dale Brennan asked me yesterday if he could be permanently assigned to community outreach. Says he wants to spend his career building bridges instead of walls." Marcus smiled at that news. Genuine transformation was rare in his line of work, but when it happened, it reminded him why he'd chosen federal law enforcement in the first place. "People can change," he said. "Sometimes they just need the right opportunity to show themselves who they really want to be." As the crowd began to disperse, Judge Hendricks approached with a small, wrapped package. "This is for you," she said. "A token of appreciation from all of us at the courthouse. We wanted you to have something to remember this day by." Inside was a gavel, engraved with the words, "Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice achieved is justice for all," and the date of both his ejection and his return. It was a beautiful piece, crafted by a local artisan, but more than that, it was a symbol of how far they'd all traveled together. That evening, driving back to Baltimore with Sarah beside him and the gavel carefully wrapped in the back seat, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The morning he'd been escorted out of the courthouse had been one of the most professionally humiliating experiences of his career. Yet it had also become one of the most meaningful, leading to changes that would affect countless people in positive ways. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Dad, saw the coverage of today's ceremony online. You're my hero, not because of what you do, but because of how you do it. Love you." Marcus showed the message to Sarah, who squeezed his hand. "She's right, you know. You could have let that September morning make you bitter. Instead, you turned it into something beautiful." As they drove through the gathering dusk toward home, Marcus thought about the power of choosing dignity over anger, justice over revenge, and hope over cynicism. Those choices weren't always easy, but they were always worth making. The courthouse gavel would sit on his desk for the rest of his career, a daily reminder that even the most challenging moments could become opportunities for positive change, if you had the courage to see them that way. Thank you for joining me on this journey of dignity, justice, and hope. If this story moved you, please like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Until next time, remember that every interaction is a chance to choose understanding over assumption, kindness over judgment.